December 18th, 1944. Stringtown Internment Camp, Oklahoma. The final, mournful note of taps had dissolved into the freezing dark, leaving only the sound of the wind rattling the glass. Hannah, a nurse captured in Manila, pulled the thin cotton sheet higher over the shivering shoulders of Mickey, a teenage orderly. The floorboards were ice against her bare feet. Propaganda posters from home had shown grinning American demons with horns. Every footstep outside confirmed that terror. Clomp, clomp, pause. Heavy boots stopped outside Barrack 7. A key scraped the lock. Hannah shoved Mickey behind a stack of empty metal cots, her own breath seizing. Shh, Daijobu, she whispered, her voice trembling. The door swung open, spilling yellow light onto the floor. 2 guards, impossibly tall, silhouetted against the night. They smelled of wet wool and lye soap. Hannah shut her eyes, waiting for the shout, the rifle butt. Silence. She forced one eye open. The men were not looking at them. They were carefully placing a heavy stack of dark, new blankets on the nearest cot. They nodded once, then pulled the door shut. The lock clicked. Hannah waited a full minute before moving. Their stories, often lost to history, remind us of the complex truths of war. If these unheard voices resonate with you, consider following our channel and sharing where you are watching from. Hannah crept toward the stack. She touched the top blanket. It was thick wool, warm and soft. It felt impossible. 3 weeks earlier, the Philippine General Hospital, Manila. The cold did not just seep in, it attacked. It was an invasive, predatory cold, utterly alien to anything Hannah had known in Manila. It found the gaps in the warped wooden planks of Barrack 7, sliding like needles under her thin cotton uniform, making the act of breathing a conscious, painful effort. They had been herded off the train hours earlier, shoved into this barren room while the Oklahoma sun bled out behind a razor-wire horizon. The journey from the coast had been a blur of incomprehensible commands and the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel, each mile pushing them deeper into the enemy's continent. Hannah pressed herself against Mickey, the young orderly whose shivering seemed to vibrate through Hannah's own bones. Mickey was barely 16, captured when the field hospital was overrun. Her eyes, wide and dark in the gloom, fixated on the single mesh-covered window. They said the demons have blue eyes, Mickey whispered, her voice catching on a sob. They are just men, Hannah replied, though the words felt hollow in her own mouth. She was a nurse. She understood biology. But the propaganda posters tacked up in quarters back home were hard to erase. Grinning, horned figures emerging from fire, their faces twisted in malice. The Americans she had seen so far, tall, loud, smelling of wool and unfamiliar tobacco, seemed closer to those posters than to any men she had known. She tried to focus on the rhythms of the barrack, the rituals of survival. The 20 women in the room had claimed their territories, metal cots with mattresses stuffed with stiff, rustling straw. There were no blankets, only a single thin sheet for each cot, white and cold as a shroud. Hannah had given hers to Mickey, who was coughing weakly. The light outside shifted from gray to a deep, bruised purple. A profound silence fell over the camp, broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen gravel. The perimeter patrol. Each footstep was a hammer blow against Hannah's nerves. This was not war as she had understood it. This was something else. A waiting room for death. She thought of the hospital in Manila, the familiar humid heat, the smell of antiseptic and hibiscus, the reassuring weight of her rounds notebook. Here there was nothing familiar. The air smelled of pine and something metallic, like snow. A sudden, piercing sound split the air. A lone trumpet playing a melody so mournful it felt like a physical weight. The notes hung in the freezing air, clean and final. One of the older women, a fisherman's wife from Nagasaki, began to recite a quiet prayer. Mickey grabbed Hana's arm. "What is that?" "Taps," a voice muttered from the corner. It was another woman, one who had lived in California. "It means the day is over. They play it for the dead." Hana closed her eyes. Taps. The end of the day. The formal beginning of the terror. The patrols would stop crunching. The real sounds of the night would begin. The propaganda was right. This was hell, and the trumpet was its herald. She pulled Mickey closer, bracing herself against the dark, waiting for the first scream. The trumpet's last note had barely faded when the new sound began. It was not the distant, rhythmic crunch of the perimeter guards. This was heavier, closer. It moved with deliberate purpose along the wooden walkway outside their barrack. Clomp, clomp. Pause. The sound stopped directly outside their door. Every woman in the room went rigid. The faint, prayer-like murmuring ceased. The only sound was the wind and Mickey's breathing, which had become a series of tiny, terrified gasps. Hana felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her skin cold and tight. A metallic scraping noise. A key was sliding into the lock. Panic, cold and absolute, erupted in the room. Women scrambled from their cots, tripping over each other in the dark, desperate to find a deeper shadow. "Hana-san!" Mickey cried, her voice a strangled whisper. Hana grabbed the younger woman's arm, yanking her from the cot. She shoved Mickey behind a stack of empty metal bed frames piled in the darkest corner of the barrack, pressing the girl flat against the wall. Hana shielded her with her own body, her heart hammering against her ribs so violently she thought it might break. "Shh, Daijobu," Hana whispered. The reassurance meant more for herself than for Mickey. "It's okay." A lie. The door creaked open. A shaft of harsh yellow light from the yard lamps sliced through the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the frigid air. Two figures stood silhouetted in the doorway. They were impossibly tall, their shoulders broadened by thick winter coats. They smelled of the outside, of wet wool, pine, and the sharp, clean scent of lye soap. Hana squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. This was it. The moment the posters had warned of. The moment her father had told her to choose death over. She waited for the shout, the rough hands, the butt of a rifle. Nothing came. Just an eerie, profound silence, broken only by Mickey's stifled sobs behind her. Hana forced one eye to open, peering through her lashes. The men were not looking at them. They had not moved past the doorway. Their faces, shadowed by the brims of their caps, were turned toward an empty cot near the entrance. One of the guards, the taller one, shifted. He was holding something bulky and dark. He moved with a heavy sigh, a sound not of malice but of exhaustion, and placed a large, neatly folded stack on the cot's straw mattress. The second guard did the same. They paused for a moment, their breath pluming in the cold air of the barrack. They scanned the room, but their gaze seemed to pass over the shadows where the women cowered. Then, the first guard nodded once, as if to himself. They turned, stepped back outside, and pulled the door shut. The lock clicked, securing them inside once more. The yellow light was gone. The only sound was the wind and the echo of the women's shared, held breath, finally, raggedly, released into the dark. The morning after the blankets arrived, Hana awoke with a stiff neck and a volatile new feeling. Purpose. The fog of terror had lifted, replaced by the chilling clarity of their situation. They were not prisoners awaiting execution. They were internees, subject to rules, and the rules, it seemed, included warmth. That implied order, and where there was order, there was protocol. She left Mickey sleeping, now cocooned in the heavy wool, and made her way to the camp administration building, a longer, better constructed version of her own barrack. She followed the signs for the infirmary. The air inside was shockingly different. It was hot, almost stifling, and carried the biting, sterile smells of carbolic acid, alcohol, and the strong lye soap used for scrubbing the floors. It was the smell of a hospital. It was the smell of home. A stern-looking American woman in a crisp, olive-drab officer's uniform sat at a desk, writing furiously in a ledger. Her hair was pinned back so tightly it pulled at her temples. A simple bar on her collar identified her as a captain. This was the woman in charge. Hannah stood silently at the door, waiting to be acknowledged. The woman looked up. Her eyes were pale blue and exhausted. "What is it?" Her voice was flat, devoid of curiosity or malice. Hannah bowed slightly, a gesture of habit. "I am nurse," she said, pointing to herself. The English words felt thick and clumsy. "I work. Hospital. Manila." The captain's gaze sharpened. She stood up, walking around the desk. She was tall, like the guards, and seemed completely unfatigued by the cold or the hour. She stopped directly in front of Hannah, close enough that Hannah could smell the faint scent of coffee on her breath. "You're a nurse?" the captain repeated. She did not sound impressed. She sounded suspicious. Hannah nodded, meeting the woman's gaze. "Show me your hands," the captain ordered, holding out her own. Hannah, confused, slowly extended her hands, palms up. The captain, whom Hannah would come to know as Miller, took Hannah's right hand. Her grip was strong and clinical. She ran a thumb over Hannah's fingertips, then traced the calluses at the base of her fingers, the specific hardened skin from years of handling instruments, rolling bandages, and bracing patients. Captain Miller's expression did not change, but the tension in her shoulders eased fractionally. The skepticism in her eyes was replaced by pragmatic assessment. She was not seeing a Jap prisoner. She was seeing a pair of trained hands, and the ledger on her desk spoke to how badly she needed them. The infirmary was overflowing with influenza cases, both from the guards and the internees. Miller dropped Hannah's hand. She turned to a supply closet, took out a bar of harsh brownish lye soap, and tossed it to Hannah. "Scrub in," Miller commanded, gesturing to a basin. "You'll start in Ward C influenza. They're coughing up their lungs." She paused. "If you steal so much as an aspirin, I'll have you back in that barrack permanently. Understood?" "Yes," Hannah said, the word clear and firm. "Understood." As she scrubbed her hands and forearms, the familiar stinging scent of the lye soap erasing the grime of the journey, she looked into Ward C. It was a long room, identical to her own, but warmer. There were 20 cots. On every single one, draped over a sick internee, was one of the same thick navy blue wool blankets. And standing guard by the exit, holding a clipboard, was one of the two men from the night before. He looked at her, nodded once in brief acknowledgement, and turned back to his paperwork. Work in the infirmary was a brutal, familiar mercy. The rhythms of changing sheets, taking temperatures, and swabbing throats were the same in Oklahoma as they had been in Manila. The virus was the great equalizer. It did not care about uniforms. Captain Miller was a demanding superior, but she was fair. She drove Hannah and the other American nurses with the same relentless, exhausted energy. Hannah found a strange comfort in the exhaustion. It left no room for the paralyzing fear. After a 12-hour shift, Miller nodded toward the door. "Mess hall. You eat with the staff." Hannah was not prepared for the mess hall. It was loud, chaotic, and smelled overwhelmingly of boiled coffee, steamed cabbage, and baked bread. It was nothing like the quiet, communal meals of rice and pickled fish she remembered. American nurses and corpsmen sat at long wooden tables, shouting to each in rapid, clipped English, their laughter booming in the small space. She took a thick, white ceramic tray and moved down the line. A burly man in a white apron slapped a slice of grayish-pink meat onto her plate. "Spam," he grunted. Next came a scoop of pale, overcooked cabbage and a ladle of gravy. At the end of the line was a stack of bread. It was not the white, fluffy bread she had occasionally seen. This was dark brown, almost black, and looked heavy like damp earth. Hana sat alone at the end of a table, the noise of the room washing over her. She stared at the food. The spam was impossibly salty. The cabbage was limp and watery, but it was the bread that held her captive. She picked up the slice. It was dense with a strong, sour smell of yeast and malt. It was the smell of the camp, of this foreign land. It was everything rice was not. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of homesickness, so acute it made her stomach clench. She thought of a simple bowl of okayu, rice porridge, and the delicate, clean flavor of pickled plum. This food was heavy, loud, and aggressive. She could not eat it. She felt the eyes of the other nurses on her, their chatter dipping slightly as they observed the new addition. She felt alien, marked. A tray clattered onto the table opposite her. She looked up. It was the guard from the infirmary, the one who had brought the blankets. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps only 20. He unbuttoned his heavy coat and sat down, nodding a simple ma'am at her. He watched her for a moment, his gaze neutral. He saw her untouched plate, her hands still hovering over the dark bread. He seemed to understand. He did not say anything, which Hana was grateful for. Instead, he took a slice of the rye bread from his own plate. He deliberately took a small pat of butter, spread it evenly from crust to crust with his own knife, and then simply pushed his plate across the table toward her. He tapped the bread. "Rye," he said, the word clear. Then he tapped his own chest. "Evans." He pointed to the bread again. "Eat. Good." Hana looked at the slice of bread. It was a simple offering, a gesture that required no shared language, no complex understanding of politics. It was just food. It was, she realized, the same as the wool blanket, a basic human provision offered without malice. She picked it up. She took a small bite. The crust was tough, the inside chewy. The sourness of the rye was cut by the rich, salty creaminess of the butter. It was not like rice. It would never be like rice. But it was not poison. It was warm, and it was filling. She ate the entire slice, nodded once to Evans, and said, "Hana." He nodded back, then turned his full attention to his own plate of spam. The connection was over, but it had been made. Hana picked up her fork and began to eat. The last 2 weeks of December settled into a routine defined by sickness and scrubbing. Hana worked until her back ached, and her hands were raw from the lye soap, and she was grateful for it. The physical exhaustion was a shield, keeping the larger, more existential questions at bay. She shared brief, practical exchanges with Evans, learned the names of the other nurses, and began to parse Captain Miller's clipped commands. Then came the evening of December 24th. Hana noticed the change as soon as she entered the infirmary for her night shift. The air, usually thick with the scent of antiseptic and fever, was tinged with something new, the sharp, green smell of pine. In the corner of the staff room, someone had propped up a small, scraggly evergreen tree and decorated it with strings of popcorn and crude ornaments folded from paper bandages. Worse than the tree, however, was the sound. On Captain Miller's desk, a small Bakelite radio was playing music. It was not the brassy, chaotic swing music Hana had occasionally heard. This was slow choral music, full of layered harmonies that felt ancient and deeply sad. The American nurses, however, seemed to find it comforting. They hummed along as they worked, their movements a little lighter, their voices a little softer. Hana went about her duties, changing linens and checking temperatures, but the music followed her. It felt intrusive, a violation. Every gentle note of peace felt like a lie. She thought of her brother, somewhere in the South Pacific. She thought of her parents in Nagasaki, likely huddled in a cold room, listening not to choirs, but to the drone of air raid sirens. A profound, suffocating guilt washed over her. Here she was, warm, fed, and protected by the very wool blankets the enemy provided, while her people were dying under a rain of American fire. This celebration, this normalcy, was an obscenity. One of the younger nurses, a kind woman from Texas named Clara, offered Hannah a cookie from a tin. "Christmas Eve, Hannah. Have one." Hannah stared at the cookie, shaped like a star. She felt her stomach revolt. She shook her head, muttering, "No, thank you," and fled to the relative quiet of the sluice room, her hands shaking. She was an enemy. She was a prisoner. She had no right to their cookies, no right to their peace. She stayed there, scrubbing bedpans that were already clean, until she heard Miller's voice cut through the music. "Hannah, my office." Hannah dried her hands and went, bracing herself. Miller was at her desk, finishing paperwork. The radio played a soft, haunting song called "Silent Night." Miller did not look up. "It is Christmas Eve," Miller stated, as if reporting a patient's symptom. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small, rectangular cardboard box. It was plain, save for a single red cross stamped on the lid. She slid it across the desk. "From the Red Cross," Miller said, finally meeting Hannah's eyes. Her gaze was as tired as ever, but the suspicion was gone. "Merry Christmas, Hannah." Hannah looked at the box. She had no gift to offer in return. She felt exposed, ashamed. She took the box, bowed deeply, and whispered, "Thank you, Captain." She waited until she was back in the empty hallway to open it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were 3 items: a bar of scented soap, a new bone-white toothbrush, and a small rectangular bar of Hershey's chocolate. Hannah stared at the toothbrush. It was such a small, civilized thing, such a precise, personal object, worlds away from the communal misery of the barrack. Miller had not just dismissed her. She had called her by her name. She had acknowledged her, not as a prisoner, but as a person, on their most holy night. Hannah did not feel joy, but the crushing weight of her guilt shifted, just slightly, to make room for something else, a complex, painful, and undeniable gratitude. January brought a deeper, more brittle cold to Oklahoma. The work at the infirmary continued, a monotonous cycle of fevers breaking and new ones arriving. Hannah had settled into the rhythm. She had learned the English words for blanket, water, and fever. She received quiet nods from Guard Evans during his rounds and respectful, if distant, professionalism from Captain Miller. The small gifts from Christmas, the toothbrush, the chocolate, were hidden away in her cot, talismans of a complex, fragile peace. She had begun to let her guard down. The immediate, primal fear from that first night had receded, replaced by the weary diligence of her nursing duties. The world had shrunk to the walls of the infirmary. One afternoon, she entered the small staff room for her break. Clara, the nurse from Texas, was there, finishing a cup of coffee. She smiled at Hannah, but her expression was tight, uneasy. Clara quickly folded the newspaper she had been reading and stuffed it into her bag, but she was not quick enough. Hannah had already seen the photograph on the front page. It was a grainy, long-distance shot of the camp, clearly showing the guard towers and the rows of barracks. Underneath it, a headline in thick black letters screamed indignation. When Clara left, a second copy of the paper remained on the table, left behind by another staff member. It was the Oklahoman. Hannah picked it up. She could not read the words, but the tone was unmistakable. The photograph was an accusation. She carried it back to Clara, who was checking charts at the nurse's station. Please, Hannah asked quietly, pointing to the headline. What? This? Clara flushed, her eyes darting toward Captain Miller's office. Oh, Hannah, it's nothing. Just politics. People back home, they don't understand. Please, Hannah insisted, her voice firmer. Clara sighed, her Texas accent flattening with reluctance. She pointed to the largest words. It says, "Why are we coddling the enemy?" She looked pained. And this part here, she traced a sentence lower down. It asks, "Why provide new wool blankets for Japs when our own boys are freezing in Europe?" The blood drained from Hannah's face. Japs. The word was a slap. Coddling. She had known, abstractly, that the outside world hated her. But the article made it personal. It took the most profound, transformative act of humanity she had experienced, the impossible gift of the wool blanket, and twisted it into a betrayal, a political crime. The fear, the suspicion she had felt that first night rushed back in, cold and acidic. Evans's gesture with the rye bread, Miller's gift of a toothbrush. Were they all just isolated acts, exceptions to a rule of overwhelming hatred? The article suggested the guards and staff were being criticized, perhaps even investigated, for their basic decency. She suddenly felt exposed, as if the entire state of Oklahoma was staring at her through the barbed wire, furious at her for simply being warm. She was still standing there, staring blankly at the ink, when Captain Miller emerged from her office. Miller saw the newspaper in Hannah's hand. She saw Hannah's pale, stricken face. Her own expression hardened into a mask of pure irritation. She strode over, snatched the newspaper from Hannah's grip without a word, and crumpled it into a tight ball. She did not look at the headline. She did not need to. She threw the balled-up paper into a metal waste bin, where it landed with a dull thud. "We have work to do, nurse," Miller said, her voice sharp and final. "Stop reading garbage." She turned and walked back into her office, leaving Hannah alone in the hallway, the echo of that single, dismissive word, garbage, hanging in the air as a defiant, protective shield. In early February, a notice was posted in the barracks and the infirmary. The International Red Cross had arranged for a dispatch of mail. Internees would be permitted to send one postcard to their families in Japan. The news sent a jolt of simultaneous hope and anxiety through Hannah. Her family. The words themselves felt like a wound. She had built a wall around the thought of them, a necessary defense against a grief she could not afford to feel. To write to them was to acknowledge they might still exist, and to invite the possibility that they did not. But she had to try. She had to tell them she was alive. She was issued the card by Captain Miller, who handed it over with the same lack of ceremony as she handed out aspirin. It was a flimsy piece of pale gray cardstock, bearing the official stamp of the U.S. Army censor and the emblem of the ICRC. The rules were printed at the top, first in English and then in Japanese. 25 words, maximum. Do not discuss the war, politics, military movements, or camp conditions. Write legibly. Hannah sat on her cot that night, the wool blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, staring at the empty lines. Mickey and the other women watched her, their faces etched with a silent, shared yearning. Hannah was one of the few who was fully literate. She would be writing cards for many of them. But first, she had to write her own. 25 words. How could she condense the universe of her experience? The terror, the cold, the confusion, the blankets, the lye soap, the rye bread, the editorial, into 25 words? She picked up the blunt pencil. "Mother, Father," she wrote, "I am alive." She paused. What came next? "I am well?" That felt like a lie. She was exhausted, heartsick, and imprisoned. But "I am unwell." That would be censored, and it would only cause them unimaginable pain. She thought about the editorial. She could not write. The Americans are kind. That would be propaganda, and the censor would surely strike it. It was also, as the newspaper proved, not entirely true. She could not write, I was afraid, as that implied criticism of her captors. She was trapped. The rules of censorship were designed to erase the very truth she was living. They demanded a simple, flat reality that did not exist. She looked around the barrack, at the women huddled under their own dark blankets. She thought of her work, the sterile smell of the infirmary, the weight of the toothbrush in her hand. These things were real. They were tangible. They existed outside of politics. She put the pencil back to the card, her hand steady. She would not write about feelings. She would write about facts. Mother, father, I am alive. I am working as a nurse. The winter is cold. I have a warm blanket. She counted in her head. It was enough. It said everything. It was an objective fact that the camp was cold. It was also an objective fact that she had a wool blanket. The censor could not strike it. It was a simple statement of provision, like food or water. But she knew, or perhaps only hoped, that her mother would understand the code. Warm blanket. It was the one detail that mattered. It was the message that went beyond survival. It signaled an absence of cruelty. It meant that, in the midst of the great global hatred, someone, somewhere, had followed a rule that resulted in her warmth. I pray you are safe. Your daughter, Hannah. She handed the card to the censor the next morning, a blank-faced lieutenant who scanned it, stamped it, and tossed it into a canvas bag without expression. She watched it disappear, a tiny, fragile piece of her truth, sent out into the void. The incident with the newspaper left a subtle poison in the air. Hannah performed her duties with the same efficiency, and Captain Miller treated her with the same brusque respect, but the sense of fragile safety had been fractured. Hannah felt the weight of the outside world's hatred pressing against the wire fence. The cold of the Oklahoma winter was nothing compared to the chill she now felt from the occasional curious stare or the sudden silence when she entered the mess hall. She needed an escape, not just from the barracks' oppressive gloom or the infirmary's scent of sickness, but from her own circulating thoughts. She found it by accident. Tucked away behind the administration building was a small, heated hut with a sign, Camp Library, YMCA. She had assumed it was forbidden, another space exclusively for the American staff. But she had seen Clara, the nurse, go inside, and the rules posted on the door said nothing about internees, only quiet must be maintained. One bitter afternoon, with 2 hours free before her shift, she pushed the door open. The room was warm, dry, and blessedly silent. It smelled of floor wax, radiators, and old dry paper. It was tiny, perhaps only 20 feet square, lined with rough wooden shelves holding a few hundred books. A single large table sat in the middle. It was, like the infirmary, a pocket of civilization. But she was the only internee present. 2 corpsmen sat reading at the far end of the table, and her stomach tightened. She felt the immediate unwelcome prickle of being an intruder. Then she saw him. Guard Evans was sitting in a corner chair, feet up on a stool, deeply absorbed in a thick paperback. He was on duty, his rifle leaning against the wall next to him, but his presence felt different here, less like a guard, more like a librarian. He looked up when she entered. He did not seem surprised. He simply nodded, a silent ma'am, and returned to his book, granting her the dignity of his disinterest. Hannah moved hesitantly to the shelves. The books were an impenetrable wall of English, The Grapes of Wrath, A Farewell to Arms, The History of the American West. The titles were meaningless, the language dense. She felt a familiar sting of frustration. She was surrounded by knowledge, but she could not access it. She drifted toward the corner Evans was in. Near him was a low shelf holding a small collection of brightly colored, thinner books, the children's section. She saw covers with pictures of dogs, trains, and farm animals. She knelt, her fingers grazing the spine of a book with a simple drawing of a bear and a small boy. She felt Evans's eyes on her. She tensed, preparing to be told to leave, to not touch the property. Instead, she heard his boots on the floor. He crouched beside her. He smelled of wool and coffee. He gently took the book from her hand. It was called Winnie the Pooh. He opened it to the first page. "See?" he whispered, pointing. "Simple words. Here is Edward Bear." Hannah looked at the text, then at the simple line drawing. She could almost parse it. Evans stood up. He walked to the small desk at the front, took a blank index card from a drawer, and dipped a pen in an inkwell. He motioned for her to come over. "Name?" "Hana Tanaka." He wrote her name carefully on the top line. Below it, he wrote Barrack 7 and the date. He did not ask for permission. He did not fill out a complex form. He simply created a library card out of nothing. He handed the card to her, then stamped the inside cover of the book and slid it across the desk. "Good book," he said, his voice low. "Easy English. Bring it back in 2 weeks." Hannah looked at the small, stiff card in her hand. It was the second piece of paper that officially bore her name in this camp, the first being her internee identification. But this one felt different. This was not a mark of her capture. It was an invitation. It was a token of trust, as simple and as profound as the wool blanket had been. She carried the book back to her barrack, the library card tucked safely in her pocket. That night, long after taps had sounded, she lay under her heavy blanket, a flashlight shielded by her hand, and began to read, sounding out the strange, gentle words about a bear with very little brain in a world entirely separate from the war. The spring of 1945 thawed the Oklahoma plains, bringing with it a nervous electric tension. The war in Europe was over. The camp guard spoke of it in loud celebratory tones, but the war in the Pacific raged on, becoming more desperate, more suicidal. Hannah read about it in the papers Evans now quietly left for her, her stomach twisting at the names Okinawa, Iwo Jima. The casualty lists grew longer on both sides. She continued her work, her English now functional, her role in the infirmary solid. The lines that had once defined her, nurse, prisoner, enemy, had blurred into a single, weary identity. The news came on a stifling afternoon in mid-August. It did not arrive as a formal announcement, but as a wave of sound from outside the wire. Shouts, car horns, and then the camp siren began to wail, not in warning, but in a sustained, joyous shriek. A corpsman burst into the infirmary, his face red with sweat and excitement. "It's over. God Almighty, it's over. They surrendered. Japan surrendered." The infirmary stopped. A tray of instruments clattered to the floor. Clara burst into tears, hugging another nurse. The celebration that erupted was explosive, a violent release of pent-up tension. Hannah stood frozen, a clean bandage halfway unrolled in her hands. Over? Surrendered? The words were nonsensical. Japan did not surrender. Surrender was the ultimate shame, worse than death. It was a cultural and spiritual impossibility. She thought of her father, of her brother. She thought of the propaganda. This was a trick, a final, cruel lie. But as the day wore on, the truth became undeniable. She heard the words atomic bomb and Hiroshima. Later, Nagasaki, her home. The world tilted. The floor of the infirmary seemed to fall away. The sounds of celebration outside, the shouting, the laughter, the swing music blaring from the radio, became a grotesque, deafening roar. She walked out of the infirmary in a daze, past a celebrating guard who did not even see her, and went to her barrack. She climbed onto her cot and pulled the wool blanket up over her head, shutting out the light. She did not cry. She was hollow. There was nothing left to cry with. She had lost. Her country, her family, her past, all of it had been incinerated or disgraced. The kindness she had received here, the blanket, the bread, the book, now felt like a complicated, bitter footnote to an incomprehensible tragedy. She stayed there for a full day. Mickey tried to talk to her, but Hannah did not answer. On the second night, Captain Miller's voice cut through her stupor. The captain was standing in the doorway of the barrack. "Hannah, get up. You're late for your shift." Hannah stared at her, uncomprehending. "The war is over." "The influenza is not," Miller said, her voice flat. "Get up. Scrub in. We have work." It was the cruelest and most necessary kindness. Miller was not treating her as a vanquished enemy. She was treating her as a nurse. She was ordering her back to the only identity that still made sense. Hannah mechanically followed her back to the infirmary. It was quiet. The post-celebration exhaustion had set in. That evening, Miller spoke to Hannah, Clara, and the two other Japanese orderlies. "Tonight," Miller said, "we will eat in the staff office, not the mess hall." When Hannah entered the small office, she stopped. The captain's desk had been pushed against the wall. In its place was a simple folding table, but it had been covered with a clean, stark white tablecloth brought from Miller's own quarters. It was a powerful, shocking symbol of formality, of peace. There were proper ceramic plates, not tin trays. Miller, Evans, Clara, Hannah, and the two orderlies sat down. There was no celebration. The mood was somber, respectful, and deeply awkward. It was not a victor's party. It was a wake. Hannah sat, her hands trembling in her lap. She had brought her wool blanket with her, folded. It had become her security, her only permanent possession. She kept it folded neatly on her knees beneath the table. Miller poured coffee into real mugs. "We do not know what comes next," the captain said, looking at everyone. "We do not know where any of us will be. But tonight, we are colleagues." Hannah looked at the crisp, white tablecloth. She looked at the steam rising from her mug. She looked at Evans, who gave her a small, sad smile. She looked at Miller, who nodded at her, acknowledging her pain. The great ideological war of horned demons and subhuman enemies had collapsed. In its place was this: a quiet room, a table covered in white linen, and a group of tired people from opposite ends of a broken world sharing coffee. The transformation was complete. Hannah picked up her mug, her fingers brushing the worn wool of the blanket on her lap. She looked directly at Captain Miller. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet, but her English, for the first time, perfectly clear.